Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome back to the program Kim Leigh-Tursi. She's a financial services industry analyst and also a Young Voices contributor. Kim, good to see you once again.
Good to see you too. I'm glad to be back.
So for the sake of people who are hearing you for the first time, though, give us a little bit of your background, and then we've got a wonderful topic to dive into.
Yeah, of course. So I am currently an analyst in the financial services industry, as you introduced. I'm based in Wilmington, Delaware, and I really enjoy reading about current things that's going on in tech and business. So this article is definitely a product of those interests.
I'm looking at your article for DC Journal, and you know what? This opened my eyes because the first line, it's official, making the best available search engine the preset default is now illegal. And boy, I'll tell you, when I go to set up a browser, often I get asked, hey, do you want to make this your default? Talk to me about Google search and default status, and what was the nature of this federal ruling that took place back in August that would make it illegal for that to be the preset default?
Yeah, of course. So within the general search industry, a lot of times browsers or devices will make agreements and have contracts for who is the factory default for their product. So in most cases, that's going to be Google because it is widely recognized as the best search engine that we have in the industry. And recently, that was ruled to be illegal and in violation of the Section 2 of the Sherman Antitrust Act.
Now, how long has the Sherman Antitrust Act been around? I just want to give some context of, this isn't like somebody just made up a new law. That act's been around a while, hasn't it?
It has, and I can't tell you the exact date, but I feel like it's been around at least 100 years.
Yeah, I want to say like late 19th century is when that came into to being. And again, I know that there's a lot of nuance here, but why was the Sherman Antitrust Act made law in the first place?
Yeah, so the context of that was around the industrialization of the United States, and you had a lot of these big companies emerging that were really, growing, and they had monopoly power over industries like oil, steel, and because of that, they could control the prices. They had a ton of power in the market, and they were able to use that power to exploit their workers, to really set predatory pricing, and overall it was just a bad environment for consumers. So I would say that's the context. And now today they apply that framework to a variety of cases, one being a lot of the antitrust cases you're seeing against big tech. And some of those, like the recent Google ruling in August, are clearly, in my opinion, straying far from the intent of original antitrust law.
So what exactly is it that Google did that required invoking Section 2 of the Sherman Antitrust Act? What are they accused of, I should say? Okay,
so in Section 2 of the Sherman Act, it's actually very simple. I think it's only a few lines long, but basically in most antitrust cases, they're evaluated along two criteria. The first being, does the company or firm in question hold monopoly power? In Google's case, they were ruled to have a monopoly in the general search services industry, which I feel like that doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. But two, the second criteria is, do they use their monopoly power, or does a firm with monopoly power engage in anti-competitive conduct? And again, this antitrust ruling against Google said that they did. And I think that is the part that I really have an issue with, because I think they're really applying faulty logic to this case.
There are some things I have some misgivings about Google. It has mainly to do with privacy and with my personal data and so forth. But I'll admit, if you give me a choice between all the different search engines and ask me which one do you think is likely to give you the best, most comprehensive result, hands down, I'm going to say Google.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not a Google stan by any means over any other random tech company out there, but I think with this case, it's a bit grating because, like you said, um, it's going to be an inconvenience to users, and also it's just the principle of it too, because you know, um, the case stated that Google is engaging in this anti-competitive conduct that forecloses part of the search market based on the framework established in another antitrust ruling, the 2001 Microsoft case, where Microsoft was found to have violated the same section, Section 2 of the Antitrust Act, because it bundled its Internet Explorer browser with its Windows operating system. And you can imagine back then in 2001, not everyone had computers, not everyone was familiar with the internet and downloading their own selective browser that they wanted. So in that case, it was or could be considered more of a barrier. But today, where 95% of people are using the internet, 95% of Americans, and there's widely available resources and tutorials for how to change your browser. If people want to change their browser, they're going to do it, and they're going to do it with ease. So I don't think that's really the exclusionary conduct that the court deems it to be.
One thing I really found interesting in your article is, in spite of the justice deeming Google's actions anti-competitive, they didn't find much in way of anti-competitive effects. And you mentioned innovation would be one of those signs. I mean, if you own the market, why do you have to get better, right? But Google continues to innovate and to improve. Is that typical behavior for someone with a solid lock on the market?
I think in the tech space, it's definitely typical. And the thing with monopoly power is that in and of itself, right, that's not a violation of antitrust law because it can often be a strong incentive to innovate and invest. But Google continues to do that because within the search industry, it is still very competitive. And we're seeing that especially with Microsoft, who has recently gained a lot of, more users with their launch of Copilot. So it is still very much a competitive space, and people in that, companies in that, do need to innovate to stay on top of it. Tech is so fast paced and fast moving that it's essential.
I really appreciated you pointing it out because, to say that they don't have incentive to innovate doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, at the same time, I'm happy to see that there's growing competition. What are some of the other search engines we might keep our eyes on? I don't think anybody's in a position to directly challenge Google at this point, but are there some up-and-comers that are making their way?
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you any specifics in terms of market share or growth figures, but I can tell you some of my personal favorites that I like to use on occasion. I love turning to DuckDuckGo occasionally for more privacy concerns, or if I'm looking for a different list of web pages. And I think like a lot of people might shuffle what they're using based on their needs. So, yeah.
Okay, good to know. And, I don't think we're going to stop using search engines anytime soon, but it's interesting you mentioned DuckDuckGo. For some people, it's a priority. That privacy is a priority, and that's one of the things DuckDuckGo has kind of hung their hat on is, we'll give you more privacy than other search engines. But it seems like it takes a little, and I mean little, bit extra effort, enough that people like me who are looking for just the path of least resistance, I'll go to Google. It's already the default. Whatever I'm giving up in privacy, I'm making up for in terms of I'm going to get my answer quickly, and that's what I really want. I assume that's probably a pretty common attitude.
Yeah, of course. And at the end of the day, like this ruling is probably not going to significantly impact the everyday life of Americans. But I think what's important to recognize in this case and the others of big tech is that it's going to shape the trajectory of the tech industry. So again, we need to look out for this.
We are talking with Kim Leigh-Tursi. She is a Young Voices contributor. Kim, so great to visit with you once again.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome Autumn Billings back to the program. She is a Young Voices contributor. Autumn, great to see you once again. For the sake of people meeting you for the first time, tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, great to see you too, and happy to be back. So by my background, so I'm in Arlington, Virginia. I've been out here for about 6 years. I have a Bachelor's of Arts degree in both economics and political science, and I graduated from law school in 2017.
Well, I'm looking at a recent article of yours. This is in International Policy Digest. The DOJ does not respect consumer choice. And the funny thing is, even before I read the article, I was like, I agree with that. I don't know why, but I'm pretty sure you're right. Talk to me about the context in which you're making the case that consumer choice is not something respected by the Department of Justice.
Yeah, so you did cut out a little bit there, but happy to sort of jump in. And, we have these cases coming up against Google and Apple under the Sherman Act, ostensibly arguing that both are in violation of the Sherman Act and are acting as monopolies illegally. And these are coming in a time when there's really been a pushback against the consumer welfare standard that's really been in place since the 1970s, and has been what has led to a lot of the technological innovation that we've seen in the last couple of decades. So it's a little concerning to see that the DOJ is taking such a hard stance against consumer welfare in particular, and sort of going after tech big business as an illegal kind of thing to be, successful as a tech company today.
If I'm understanding this correctly, what you're saying in your article is the DOJ is setting its sights on companies like Google and Apple, not so much because they're doing wrong by the people who use their products, but because they're just too big, as if being too big is a crime in and of itself.
Correct. Yeah, we're definitely starting to see a lot of that rhetoric come out. I mean, there seems to be this idea that having too big or too powerful of tech companies, people are concerned that that might translate to something like political power or power over our lives. But really, when you start to look at it, these are companies that are really, really beholden to the consumers themselves. There is nothing stopping consumers today from choosing any sort of smartphone over an Apple iPhone or choosing a search engine over the Google search engine. But there seems to be this rhetoric out there that because they're so big, there's this sort of assumed power in the hands of the few. But as we sort of wade into these more litigation waters, what we might soon start to see is these companies will stop focusing so much on what consumers are wanting and start focusing more on winning at trial.
Wow.
And in turn, yeah. And that, I think that can really, that could cause a lot of unknowns for the future of both consumers and, the future of innovation and technology.
I was telling our previous guest, who was also talking about Google being, sued under Section 2 of the Sherman Act. I have some misgivings with Google, and I'll just tell you what they are. Like you're my therapist here. The privacy concerns are part of it, but I also have some concerns sometimes that they may throttle information, or there's some search things that I feel like sometimes get tamped down in interest of, some kind of outside influence. Now, having said that, I still use Google by far more than any other search engine, because if I'm looking for the broadest range of results, that's the one I can pretty much count on.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I've grown up with Google. So Google came on the scene when I was in middle school, and I've pretty much used it my whole life. And I've had similar instances, even researching for this op-ed even. There were times where it was actually hard for me to find some of the arguments that are against the DOJ's case using Google, which was sort of an interesting irony in and of itself, that, I kind of had to tinker with what my inputs were and how I was using the platform, but in order to find arguments that were actually pro-Google. So Google's had decades of experience with building up this platform, building on its algorithms, taking in a ton of data and information, and that's going to be hard to compete with just because they've had the time to use it. But at the end of the day, consumers are able to interact with this platform and this software in a way that gets them the results that they're looking for, and that's what matters. That's what's heightening consumer welfare. And as Google has said many times throughout this lawsuit, you can still use other search engines. Yahoo, DuckDuckGo, Bing are all options that it's fairly easy to type in a browser or a search engine and hit go and make it happen. But time and time again, people are going back to Google search for a reason, and we shouldn't ignore that that's what consumers are choosing.
Now, my understanding is that the European Union takes a much tougher stand on, issues like, well, you're a monopoly. How has Google fared in dealing with them?
Yeah, so Google was found to be a monopolist as well in the European Union not too long ago. And the way that the EU sort of handled this problem was in order to, in their view, empower consumers, set up a sort of default engine platform. So a lot of the conversations right now are around, well, there's always going to be a default search engine. And so who's going to be that default? So the European Union set up a platform. So when you pull up a browser, you get to choose which, like right off the bat, who's going to be your search engine of choice. What that has actually led to is a slight uptick in the Google search engine use of the European Union users. And there has been some pushback from competitors saying that that was a quote unquote solution to the monopoly problem that actually didn't do what it was supposedly supposed to do. But what it did in turn show is that consumers do time and time again choose Google if given the choice.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the numbers from your article, and in the EU, Google makes up 91.22% of the search engine market. And
yes,
look, again, notwithstanding, I have a few misgivings about some of their practices. I don't think it can be denied that when it comes to delivering what consumers want in terms of a search engine, they must be doing something right, because an awful lot of people, aren't running the other direction from them.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that this lawsuit in particular takes grievance with is these sort of agreements that Google has with different hardware devices, such as the Apple iPhone. It came out in trial that Google spent billions of dollars partnering with Apple to ensure that Google was the default on Apple iPhones. And while there's one take to say, like, look, this is the monopoly power, they're using their resources and their power to lock in availability and putting their product in front of consumers. But in reality, Apple knows that their users want Google. Their users know that Google works, and it would be weird and upsetting to get an Apple iPhone that doesn't work with Google. So Apple's beholden to its customers, Google's beholden to its customers, and in turn, that means customers are getting what they want. If Google was all of a sudden not the most popular search engine for one reason or another, then Apple would pick up on that, and maybe Apple wouldn't be so willing to enter an agreement with Google, right? Like, this is how market dynamics work and how competition works. Putting it in the hands of, say, a court to decide who is the search engine of consumer choice might get a little bit more murky. And eventually what we would see is less market sensitivity to what consumers are actually looking for. I
know this isn't exactly a subjective question, but are the consumers really getting much for all the effort of the DOJ intervening on their behalf? First of all, are they asking for it? Or is this just the DOJ going about like a solution in search of a problem?
Yeah, I think the people who are most outspoken about wanting this kind of court or litigation interference is really going to be Google's competitors. So the DOJ, has time and time again said that they're out there to protect competition. But in reality, what they're doing is protecting competitors, and that's sounds similar, but is very different. So there's a handful of competitors out there whom I've already mentioned, particularly in the search engine department, who would love it if Google contracts were all of a sudden null and void and they could sort of jump in and make their own agreements. But at the end of the day, still, if it's not the customers asking for this change, then you're going to put customers and consumers in sort of situation where they're not getting what they expect. They're confused. And confusion turns people off to all sorts of products, and you want that ease of use when you're sort of jumping in. Not to say that Google doesn't have its problems. We've already mentioned that, right? So people have their concerns, but it's a platform they're familiar with and a platform that they know how to engage with to make sure that they're want versus being forced into another sort of partnership with a search engine that they don't know anything about. And that uncertainty can really start to rock the boat more than maybe we'd like to see.
Once again, we are visiting with Autumn Billings. She is a Young Voices contributor. Autumn, I appreciate your take on this. And by the way, as I search for things through the coming week, I will not be taking them for granted like I was just prior to this conversation. How do people follow you on social media? Where can they find you?
Yeah, my op-eds and articles are promoted on the Young Voices Twitter, so you can find it at Young Voices on X.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome Stanton Skerjanec back to the program. I had to get a running start at your last name there, Stanton. I apologize, but I feel like I made a good effort there. Good to catch up with you once again. Now, I know for some people, they're hearing about you for the first time. Take a moment and tell us a little bit about your background.
Absolutely. My name is Stanton Skerjanec. I live in the greater St. Louis region with my wife and my daughter. I work as a communications professional for constitutional litigators. But before that, I taught government and economics, where I developed a passion and understanding for a lot of things, including the topics that we're going to be talking about today.
This is really a timely topic. I don't know if anybody's noticed, but there's a lot of military conflict going on around the world. And I noticed, I think it was just over the weekend, that President Biden had made a comment to the effect of, if someone assassinates Trump, we are willing to consider that an act of war. And I believe that was, we'll go to war with Iran if they assassinate Trump. And I went, woo. It seems like we have been in continual military conflict for more of our existence than not. And you have an article here that talks about how millennials will actually be in a position to end that policy of enduring military conflict if they're willing to take the steps to do so. So set the stage for us, first of all. How did we get here to where we're seemingly involved in nonstop wars and conflicts?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I describe it, I call it the forever war. And that's not a term I came up with. That's something that's been around for a while. It's this concept, this notion that we have been engaged across the globe for more time of our existence than not. And we could go all the way back to the revolution, say, yeah, we've had wars here and there in every generation, but that's not necessarily what we're talking about. What we're talking about is definitely since World War II, the United States has had this oversized presence, not just in global affairs in terms of economics and diplomacy, which you would assume of any great power, but almost this constant military presence. We're talking, I start with World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War I, Gulf War II. These are the ones that people know about, not to mention the smaller affairs, the small things, our constant diplomatic coverage of Israel. Now the involvement with Ukraine, how Israel's conflict is spilling over into Lebanon, then possibly Iran. So we have this constant, overwhelming presence that our hands are engaged militarily all over the world, either directly or indirectly. And even indirectly, it's still substantial.
As a kid, I grew up watching shows like The World at War, which was about World War II, and Vietnam was going on when I was a kid. And so to me, it was kind of a normalized thing that, war is cool. We played soldier. And it wasn't until I became of draft age and, started to realize, this is actually very serious. And as I started to pay attention to our governance and what our government is up to, a little alarm bell started going off when I started to realize that, the U.S. has done a lot of good in the world, but it seems like we're involved in a lot of battles that really, I think it's hard to make the case that those are our wars or our conflicts to be involved in. I'd like to get your take on, you list in the article, a lot of different instances. How many of those can we strictly say, oh yeah, that's definitely our business?
This is the constant question that Americans have been asking since we basically became one of two superpowers in World War II, and definitely since the end of the Cold War. What is our role with all of this power and might? And there's no straightforward answer to this, but here's what we can say at the very least. What we can say is we haven't been asking that question nearly enough. This is probably the most damning aspect of the forever war. We say, we have our allies that need our help. No one wants to be the coward that doesn't come to their allies' aid. But that begs the question, who are our allies and why are they our allies? Who is our enemy and why are they our enemy? We talk about Israel a lot. We consider them an ally. Why? Well, we were instrumental in getting them started, making sure that they can maintain their sovereignty. What is that legacy today? What does that look like moving forward? We're not having an honest conversation about that. When we talk about Ukraine, how did Ukraine become our ally? Did they become our ally simply because Russia is our enemy? How did Russia become our enemy? What is the history of the end of the Cold War and NATO's expansion? What does that look like? This is not to lay blame to anyone. It's certainly not to forgive any aggressors of their aggressive action, but it begs the question, the United States, what is our role in these conflicts? The fact that we're not having these questions, the fact that these questions are sometimes shunned is an aspect of the forever war perpetuating itself over and over and over again. So to the main, a lot of times people say we need a strong national defense so that we can protect ourselves and our allies. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that. A strong, if you want peace, prepare for war, that whole maxim. But that begs the question, is what we are doing preparing for defense, or is what we're doing preparing for constant aggressive entanglement?
Oh, I like how you put that. There's one question I would add to the questions you were asking too, and that is cui bono. Who benefits from these alliances and from our involvement in these conflicts? Now, you mentioned former President Dwight Eisenhower offering a warning at the end of his presidential term. Talk to us about what he was warning about, the conditions that could lead to kind of a forever war mentality.
So President Eisenhower, having been the supreme allied commander, having seen everything develop militarily in the United States, in his farewell address, he basically warned Americans about what we call the military-industrial complex. Much studied, much debated, but at the end of the day, what Eisenhower said, and what I think he's correct about, is this: if Americans if they are not careful about how corporate interests, political interests, and military interests, if they're not careful about how those are entangled, how they are interconnected, then what's going to happen is that they're all going to get so wrapped up that there is no way to escape politically, culturally, economically from war. And that's more or less effectively what's happened. I mentioned in my article that the top 5 global military contractors are all American-based. What is it? Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, et cetera, et cetera. But there are other companies that are smaller, like the Ball Corporation. These are the guys that made glass jars, the mason jars, and now they're doing tin and all that. But they make satellites for the military. They make jet parts, or Deere, right? The tractor company. They make manned utility vehicles. Wow. Every company, it seems like, has some aspect of being a military contractor, even if it's maybe not their biggest aspect. This is how the forever war keeps going, that there is an economic interest to doing war. I'm not saying that there's some secret evil network out there, but there's certainly a bad incentive for military to be as big as it is now.
We have about a minute left, but I'm going to ask you, walk us through some of the things, the 3 elements that we have to embrace to start to end that forever war.
Yeah. So the first thing that I mentioned in my article is that we really have to walk back this notion that we're not at fault. The United States probably is encouraging this forever war. I mean, our military budget is 53% of discretionary. That's 3% of our GDP. By the way, that military budget of $916 billion is like half of Russia's entire GDP. All right. So there's that. Second, we have to make sure that the president's almost unilateral power to wage war is curtailed. That's either got to be done by Congress or by constitutional amendment. That's hard. It's been tried before and not to great success, but millennials, as they come into power, have to do that. And third, speaking about millennials again, as we come into power, as we're raising children, we have to build up this culture that war should not be seen as a good thing. I know it's kind of weird to say that. Everyone should already know that. War is not good, and we need to raise families and build relationships that affirm that over and over and over again.
Again, we are talking with Stanton Skerjanec. This is such a great message. Thank you for giving voice to it. Where can people find you, and where can they follow your work?
Absolutely. They can follow me at my Substack, Canons of Concord. That'll be at Skerjanec, SKERJANEC at .substack.com. My Substack tag is also at Mr. Scourge, MRSKERJ.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment of today's Moving Forward with Young Voices. Very happy to welcome Matt Cookson back to the program. Matt is a Young Voices contributor, as well as he works in the supply chain with the U.S. defense contractor. And I think you wear a few other hats too, don't you, Matt?
I'm pretty involved at my local church. Just added the title of husband to my resume. So balancing those different responsibilities.
Well, congratulations, and it's good to catch up with you again. By the way, I'm enjoying the title of your article here on Real Clear Politics. Kamala's VP pick is a win for Republicans. I've seen nothing in the last few weeks that would persuade me that there's anything incorrect about that title. Talk to me about Tim Walz and how exactly is Minnesota Governor Tim Walz a win for the Republicans?
Well, I think we're all familiar with in elections, the way you win in a primary is by running towards the extreme in order to appeal to your hardcore base, and the way to win in the general is by running towards the middle. Unfortunately, as someone who lived under Tim Walz's Minnesota for a brief period of time, I can say that he is certainly not a moderate. I think a lot of people, when they were hearing the potential VP picks that Kamala Harris might make, Walz was by far the least likely selection of the option suggested. And the analogy that I keep going back to when his name came up in that conversation was sort of how when a football team is looking for a new coach and they'll announce a few possible names as a way to throw off the scent. I was thinking Walz is definitely a throw off the scent kind of guy, and looking at his resume and his beliefs and his time as governor of Minnesota, I would think no sane human being would possibly pick him as their VP.
So let's talk about, I mean, in the interest of fairness, we can talk about his strengths as well as his weaknesses, but specifically, let's talk about, does he really help Kamala Harris in her quest for the presidency, or what are some of the ways that he may be actually holding her back or detracting from her efforts?
Yeah. So as everyone is aware at this point, this is a razor-thin election, and you'll hear a lot when people talk about issues is, oh, this may hurt candidate X on the margins, or it may help candidate Y on the margins. But the fact is that in a marginal election like this one, anything could win or lose you your campaign. And when you talk about specifically the VP pick, some people have differing views on how important it actually matters. John Adams, in fact, our first vice president, referred to the position as a warm bucket of spit in terms of its importance. However, it can make a difference, especially in a razor-thin election. And there are the swing states that are critical to victory, these being Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, Wisconsin. Picking a candidate relating to any of those states could make all the difference in the world. And as I mentioned in my article, Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, would seemingly have been the obvious selection for that role, considering how critical that Pennsylvania is. And to the point that she picked a guy like Walz, who is the governor of Minnesota, Republicans have not won the state of Minnesota in a presidential election since, I believe, 1972. It's certainly not a state that is considered a swing state, nor does it carry a lot in the electoral college. So from the standpoint of broadening the electoral map, it really was a puzzling decision to go with the governor of Minnesota.
And let's talk about some of Walz's policies as governor that would indicate that maybe he's not going to bridge that gap of, oh, look, he's moderate. He's just one of us, because I know he's tried very hard to put forth that image of just one of the guys, his pheasant hunting trip over the weekend being a prime example of that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm no hunter, but the people I do know who are hunters look at that incident and at the very least scratch their head. And on the policy front, law and order are definitely issues that are crucial for helping Republicans to win elections. And having lived under Tim Walz during COVID after the George Floyd or during the George Floyd riots, excuse me, Walz came across as someone who, in my personal opinion, could not be trusted on this issue. As I mentioned in the article, the mayor of Minneapolis was requesting Walz, this is going to get out of control really fast. You need to send in the National Guard. And Walz kind of heed and hawed and ultimately waited days before allowing them to go in. And when they did go in, held their collars to prevent them from keeping order. As someone who was sitting on his couch in suburban Minnesota, I'm wondering, this guy is not doing anything to keep the peace. What is going to stop mobs of people from coming down to my neck of the woods? And with regard to the social issues, trans and LGBT issues are on the forefront of everyone's mind right now. And Walz is definitely a guy who is not a moderate on that issue at all. He signed a law turning Minnesota into what he calls a sanctuary state for trans youth, which would effectively create the state of Minnesota into an accomplice in the kidnapping of trans youth. That is, if a so-called transgender youth goes to Minnesota from another state, the state of Minnesota will not cooperate with that child's home state to send them back home, which for any parents out there listening, that has to be a terrifying thought to consider.
And you mentioned in the article too, this is not, these are not moderate policies, and yet if the Democrats need to pick up as many voters as possible in these swing states like Wisconsin, like Pennsylvania, they need somebody who can move that moderate needle and appear to be a safe choice. And those two examples you just gave, I'm sorry to sound out of step here, but they sound a little radical.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And one of the trump cards the Democrats have been trying to play throughout this election cycle and pretty much every election cycle lately is the issue of abortion. And while as a very conservative person, I know my personal viewpoints on the issue are very different from what most Americans believe, Tim Walz is on the complete opposite end of that equation. Most Americans do want abortion legal in some capacity, but they do want restrictions somewhere in the 12 to 14 week range is what seems to be the consensus. Tim Walz, in his debate with J.D. Vance, tried to spin that he did not sign a bill that allows restrictionless abortion in Minnesota, when that was a lie. Minnesota is one of the few states that has zero restrictions on abortion, and Tim Walz signed that law, which is something that is wildly out of step with what most Americans view on the issue.
So you were there during the COVID pandemic. I'd love to get your take on what were the state policies on things like lockdowns and masking and that sort of thing. Where did Walz fall on those issues?
Well, I think the most infamous example of his stance on this, and thankfully I didn't fall victim to it, is he set up a snitch line to have people report on their neighbors if they were violating COVID policy. This is something that none of us had ever experienced before. It's something you're used to hearing about in places like the Soviet Union. But Tim Walz was definitely one of the leading proponents of lockdowns and keeping these, draconian restrictions. And that a guy who was trying to bring this Soviet-style snitching to the United States is definitely not somebody I want anywhere near the White House.
You had mentioned his debate with J.D. Vance, and I'd love to get your reaction. I know the press, the official spin that I heard was, well, those wide eyes that Walz had at various times during that debate, that was just indicative of his passion for whatever it was he was saying. What did you see in those wide eyes as he would try to answer?
Well, it's definitely an overused expression, but it's definitely the deer in the headlights type of thing. And I've heard that the way you can tell who is winning the debate is turning off the volume and looking at the candidates' faces. And Walz did not look like a guy who was comfortable or confident in his answers. So he did not look like he was confident, and one of his assignments was to try to paint JD as a radical, and I think he failed miserably on both of those fronts.
Again, we're talking with Matt Cookson. Matt, where can people follow your work?
Yeah, so I am. They can follow me on X. I post my articles there from time to time, and you can follow me at Matt Cookson 95 on X, formerly known as Twitter.